All right, get ready, because we're diving deep into some pretty big potential changes in how the U.S. government buys
Big
things.
changes for sure.
Like imagine, a world where just about every purchase for, like all the civilian agencies goes through this one organization,
Oh.
like some kind of, giant government Amazon.
Yep.
And that's what we're going to unpack today, this idea of centralized procurement.
Exactly. And, our source for this deep dive is this recent article from Washington Technology.
Okay.
And they're really digging into this whole concept,
Yay.
Suggesting that the General Services Administration,
Mm-hmm.
the GSA, could become like the mandatory place where you have to buy things
Oh, wow.
if you're a civilian agency.
Okay, so no more, each agency doing its own contracts.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big shift, right?
It is a huge shift.
I mean, like, would the Department of Energy have to go through the GSA to buy, like, lab equipment
Potentially, yeah.
instead of, doing it themselves?
Yeah, that's the idea that's being floated.
Wow.
And as you might imagine, this is causing a lot of, back and forth.
Yeah.
Some people think it's a brilliant idea for
Yeah.
efficiency, and others think it'll be a total bureaucratic nightmare.
Oh, gosh.
But here's the thing. This isn't a brand new idea.
Oh, really?
This was actually tried before.
Huh.
Back during the Bush administration, you might remember Loretta Dunham,
Okay, yeah.
who was the GSA administrator. Back then, she tried to push things in a similar direction.
So that's where it gets interesting.
Yeah.
I remember vaguely hearing about this. But what happened? Did it work?
Well, let's just say it was a mixed bag.
Okay.
Doan. She was able to kind of persuade the Treasury Department to ditch their own telecom contract and jump onto this existing GSA contract called Networks.
Okay.
So that was like a win for centralization.
Right.
But then she hit a wall when she tried to bring in NASA's Set Debut program,
Oh.
which is this really specialized IT procurement system that they use.
Okay, so it sounds like some things are easier to centralize than others. What's the difference here?
Yeah.
Like, why did Treasury say okay and NASA say no way?
Yeah, that is the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And it gets to the heart of, is centralized procurement really even a good idea in the first place?
Okay.
Think of it this way. Commodity products and services,
Yeah.
the things that are pretty much standard across a lot of agencies, those are good candidates for centralization.
Right.
We're talking about like office supplies, basic IT hardware, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, makes sense.
But when you get into these really specialized mission-critical needs,
Right.
things get a lot trickier.
Okay.
I'm with you.
Yeah.
It makes sense that, like, the Department of Health and Human Services,
Sure.
if they're buying, specialized medical equipment,
Yeah.
that's going to require a much more tailored approach.
Exactly. Or like, an agency that needs really specific contact center solution.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where the calls are routed a certain way.
Right.
And you need deep expertise in how to set that up. That makes sense.
Those scenarios need a deep understanding of what that agency really needs.
Yeah.
And it might be tough for a centralized GSA to get their head around all that.
And that leads to, a concern that's raised in the Washington Technology article, too.
Oh, yeah.
Even if this centralized procurement is a good idea in theory,
Right.
can the GSA even do it?
Yeah.
I mean, they've been dealing with staffing cuts.
Exactly.
So how could they take on more work with fewer people?
That is the big question mark.
Yeah.
It's hanging over this whole debate.
Right.
Of course, technology can help streamline things, make things easier.
Right.
But there's a limit to how much technology can do.
Yeah.
And if the GSA isn't careful,
Yeah.
this could actually backfire
Oh, gosh.
and lead to delays and inefficiencies and get this even higher costs
Oh, wow.
because projects could get bogged down in the system.
So the idea of the GSA becoming this like all-powerful procurement hub
Yeah.
might not be the like super efficiency win
Right.
that some people are hoping for.
Exactly. And the article makes this really interesting point
Oh, yeah.
that historically the GSA has thrived in this competitive environment, where they have to compete with other agencies and other vendors.
Right.
And that competition has made them more efficient,
Yeah.
more innovative.
Okay.
So there's a worry that if you make them the only game in town, they might actually get worse.
Interesting. So becoming a monopoly could hurt their performance.
It's definitely a possibility.
Yeah.
I think it's important to emphasize,
Yeah.
this isn't about being pro or anti-GSA.
Right.
It's about what's the best way to make sure
Right.
that taxpayer money is being used wisely and that the government is getting what it needs
Yeah.
in a timely and effective way.
I like that framing.
Yeah.
We'll come back to that after the break.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny, when I first heard about this whole idea,
Uh-huh.
I was like, oh yeah, of course, centralized procurement makes total sense. But now that we're getting deeper into it,
Yeah.
I'm realizing there's a lot of potential problems.
Sure.
Like, it's way more nuanced than I thought at first.
Yeah, I think that's the beauty of a deep dive like this.
Yeah.
It's easy to just, see a headline and be like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Right?
But then when you really start digging in,
Right.
you see all the little details and the history and the potential consequences.
And the unintended
Yeah,
consequences.
exactly.
So we've talked about the pros and cons and Loretta Doan.
Right.
And, the capacity concerns at the GSA.
Uh-huh.
For our listeners who are, trying to make sense of all this,
Yeah.
what's the key takeaway?
I think the most important thing is to really be skeptical,
Okay.
no matter what your first instinct is.
Okay.
Don't just buy into the efficiency argument,
Yeah.
but also don't assume the GSA is totally incapable of handling this.
Right.
It's about weighing the evidence and considering all sides.
It's about asking the tough questions.
Exactly.
Like, can the GSA really scale up without,
Yeah.
sacrificing quality or raising cost?
Right.
And are there some purchases that just make more sense to keep decentralized?
Absolutely. And here's another thing to think about.
Okay.
Our whole discussion so far has been about civilian agencies.
Right.
What about the Department of Defense?
Oh, wow.
Could you imagine this model
Yeah.
being applied to the military?
That's a whole other level.
Yeah.
I mean, the military's needs are so unique,
That's right.
with these sensitive technologies and national security issues.
It's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah. Could you imagine centralizing the purchase of fighter jets through the GSA?
Yeah, I mean, would that even be possible?
Or a good idea?
Right, exactly.
Wow, this has been really eye-opening for me.
Yeah.
I went from thinking, oh yeah, centralized procurement sounds great, to like,
Mhm.
whoa, there's so much more to this.
And that's the whole point of this deep dive.
Right.
It's about giving our listeners the knowledge and the different perspectives so they can form their own opinions.
So to wrap up our discussion,
Yeah.
what's the final thought you want to leave with our listeners?
I would say think bigger than just the GSA. This whole conversation shows how important government contracting is and how it affects everything.
Wow, yeah.
From the stuff we use every day to the technologies that are changing the world.
It's true.
It's always a balance between efficiency, innovation, and accountability.
Right.
And it's important to stay informed and involved in these discussions.
Absolutely well said. It's amazing how much complexity there is to all this.
It really is.
We started talking about office supplies,
Uh-huh.
and now we're talking about fighter jets and national security.
Yeah, it's a wild ride.
It shows how this topic that seems kind of boring at first
Right.
actually affects so many important parts of government.
It's a microcosm of so many bigger issues.
That's a good way to put it.
The role of government, the balance of power,
Yeah.
the constant search for efficiency in these really complex systems.
It's all there in government contracting.
It's all connected.
Well said. So for our listeners who are now totally fascinated
Yeah.
by government contracts and want to learn more, where should they start?
There's a ton of information out there.
Yeah.
You could look into the history of the GSA, explore different types of contracts like CENTBP and Alliant,
Okay.
or even see how other countries handle centralized procurement.
Interesting.
There's so much to discover.
And don't forget Washington Technology,
Oh, yeah, of course.
the source for today's deep dive.
They're great.
They're a fantastic resource for staying up to date on everything that's happening in government contracting.
It's a constantly changing field
Yeah,
that affects every part of how the government works.
that's true.
And the more you learn about it, the more you understand how things actually get done.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into centralized procurement.
It's been a journey.
It has. We hope you've enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And maybe even learned a thing or two along the way.
Absolutely. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here.
Right.
Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep thinking critically.
Until next time, happy diving. It's amazing how much complexity there is to, like government purchasing.
It really is.
We started this deep dive thinking about, like office supplies and stuff.
Wow.
And now we're talking about fighter jets and national security.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild ride.
It really shows, how this topic that seems kind of mundane at first glance
Right.
actually touches so many like critical parts of government.
Absolutely. And I think it's a great example of how these things are all connected.
Yeah.
It's like a microcosm of all these bigger issues. Like, what's the role of government? How do we balance power? How do we find efficiency in these giant, complex systems?
It's all there in government contracting.
Yeah, it's all kind of woven together.
Well said. So for our listeners, who are now like totally fascinated by this world
Hopefully a few of them.
and want to learn more,
Yeah.
where would you recommend they start?
Well, the good news is there's a ton of information out there.
Okay.
You could dig into the history of the GSA. You can explore these specific contracts like SEWP or Alliant.
Okay.
Or you can even look at how other countries approach this whole centralized procurement thing.
Interesting.
There's so much to discover.
And of course, we have to give a shout out to Washington Technology,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
the source for today's deep dive.
They do great work.
They're a fantastic resource to stay up to date on, everything that's happening in this world.
Absolutely. It's constantly evolving.
Yeah,
This whole field affects every part of how the government operates.
that's true.
And the more you learn about it, the more you really understand how things get done behind the scenes.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into centralized procurement.
It's been a journey.
It has been. We hope you've enjoyed it.
Yeah,
And maybe even had a few, aha moments along the way.
I hope so.
So until next time, happy diving.